Next, I'd like to bring up one of my fellow SBC board members, Mr. Mike Williams of RWDI, and he will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Larry. Very nice to see everybody. So many familiar faces, really packed audience today. All that is wonderful. I'm from RWDI. RWDI, if you don't know us, we've been studying the interaction of the natural environment with the built environment since our founding in 1972. The climate has changed, as it says on the cover of the program, which means we need to be rethinking really everything we're doing, which is really exciting and I think provides an opportunity for us to have a whole new generation of what we're doing. But on to introducing Teresa Coady. Teresa is a professional consultant and strategic business advisor, currently completing her first book. I've often thought about writing a book myself, so I'm hoping part of the presentation is why not to write a book, so maybe try to cover off some of that. Yeah, online, okay. The book is about rebuilding the planet, 12 Principles for Conscious Construction. It's due out this spring, gonna hold you to that. She advises the Architectural Institute of British Columbia, the Association of Professional Engineers in British Columbia, the Advanced Code Knowledge Regulatory and Building Codes Committee. This is a challenge first thing in the morning, but this is a good one. She is currently a member of the NRC Technical Committee for Wildland Urban Interface Wildfire Guidelines. That's fascinating. Ms. Coady is an internationally recognized for her innovative thinking and her leadership in sustainability, and works closely with various agencies to create new policies, practices to benefit society. She has been a past board member of the UNEP, SBCI, and the VP of ISB. She's currently a member of the UNEP Global ABC, and a lot of acronyms here. This is wonderful. I'm almost done. I'll give you one more sentence, but there's so much here. It's all very good. And she's the only architect to serve on the British Columbia Provincial Government Climate Action Team. These are the kind of people that many times all these acronyms are volunteering their time and they're helping make a real difference in the world. So help me in welcoming Teresa, and I really look forward to the presentation.
Well, okay, short. Thank you everyone for coming out early and coming from wherever you've come from. That was a really good presentation, Sam. I like that you have a secret. We kind of knew your secret. I have a bit more time, so if you see me going past 9:30, that's okay. I've been told that's okay. We have a little change in the agenda today. I wanted to ask you to think about why you got into the profession or the business you're in. Why, remember back to when you were excited about your life? Try to get back to that moment. And was it because you wanted to get into construction and kind of wreck the planet? No. Was it because you wanted to reduce emissions? Was that your driving thing when you first started out as a starry-eyed early student? No. Was it to build a better world, design a better world? Most likely. Most likely. So I'd like us all to just go back to that place. And what I'm going to share with you today is my journey. And the theme of this conference is simple versus complex. But I really believe that if you want to get to simplicity, you have to process all the complexities before you can make it simple. So today I'm going to give you a lot of research information that is from fields that you might not be familiar with. I wasn't. That impact how you think and what you do, or should and will. And I hope you come away today with some ideas about things that are going to make you feel excited again about what you do, because there is huge opportunity. I'll just let you know how I got into this. When I was 18 years old, I was diagnosed with a motor neuron disorder. And I was told that by the age of 30, I would be blind and in a wheelchair. So that woke you up. That woke me up. And I thought, well, geez, if I've only got 12 years, because I was 18, well, better get married, have 2 kids, travel around the world, get an education, get a professional, start a new business. And then at the age of 32, I was like, I'm actually okay. Because what I did was I spent those early years trying to figure out how to live well, how to keep myself well. And what I realized was that our cities are making us sick. Our food, maybe, but all the stressors, the noise of the cars, the big buildings, the pollutants, all of the things that we live with every day made me sick at a very young age. And there were ways to avoid that, change that, live better, and keep myself well. And when I started my company, which became Bunting Coady Architects, it was founded in those principles. I did my thesis in 1983 on the living, breathing building. And that was all about spaces that can keep us well and, by extension, support the life around us. So that's where I came from. I believe that now is a really important time because this is the first time we're seeing our industry make the shift. It's the last industry on the planet to do it, to shift from the industrial age to the digital age. And when we make that shift, it's going to be massive. It's going to have a massive impact on everyone in the planet. Now, how do I advance these? Next? Yeah. Okay. The reason it's going to have a massive shift is because construction is the biggest industry on the planet. Now, it might not be. Weapons might be bigger, but we don't know everything we need to know about weapons. So, officially, construction is the largest industry on the planet. A lot of us have been told that there are too many of us, and the reason we have issues out there is because of population growth. Population is expected to grow by 31% by the year 2050. But construction is far outpacing population growth. Construction is expected to grow 118%, that's not even a number, by 2050. Same period. That's almost four times the growth rate of the population. So we need to really look at what we're doing here and why we're doing it. So the very first thing I want you to maybe go and look at is something that ISDE, I-I-S-D-E, it's different from the group I'm with, ISB, in Winnipeg, Canada, has come up with, and it's called the Comprehensive Wealth Model. And it's being looked at and adopted worldwide. It is the 5 capitals that we need to start measuring. We already measure the financial and the produced capital, we call that GDP, but we need to measure the human, social, and natural capitals. Human capital is just the health of each individual, like do your babies live to 5? Do your adults live into old age? Social capital is basically the resilience of your community. If you have a disaster, is it going to be like Katrina, where everyone goes and loots the stores? Or is it going to be like Fukushima, where people support each other? What is your social resilience factor? And your natural capital, I think we all know what that is. How are your ecosystems doing? Do you have the water, the fresh air, and the materials that you need for wealth? So in order to move into this future, we need to rethink what we measure. And as you do your work, convince your clients and your policy agencies that these metrics are the future. So I have these 12 principles of conscious construction in my book, Rebuilding Earth. Everyone says you forget to say the title, so that's it, Rebuilding Earth. And I'm going through them backwards because the first one is the foundation. So number 12 is the one where we look at the capitals and we say measure these capitals. Number 11 is measure happiness first. And I believe that if we do that, we do that intuitively as designers, and you know, that's what we want. We want to create this happiness. But for us to understand what happiness is, there was something I learned that I don't know if all of us have ever heard of. Once you get past the most fundamental, providing safe, secure transit, community gardens for food security, aging in place, those sort of basics around keeping people secure so that they feel safe and then they can begin to be happy, you need to really go into brain science. And we have 3 brains. The thinking brain, the neocortex on top, which is where we all operate, especially the engineers, gotta say. Then we have the lower brain, the reptilian brain, but the middle brain is the limbic brain. That's your mammalian brain. That's what makes you a mammal, but it's also what makes you a pack animal, and it's what makes you connect to others. And there's something called limbic resonance. And you've heard of mirror neurons, hopefully? It's okay. When you are face to face with another human being, your body has these mirror neurons that reads the other person's emotions, but also, and we don't understand how this happens, your limbic brain begins to vibrate at a frequency that is the same as all the other people in the group. And that's why sometimes you have drum ceremonies and all that to get that frequency shared more quickly. But when we're in a group environment, we get this thing called limbic resonance. And that's why it's really important for us to design for face-to-face human interactions. And that's what we're missing when we don't have those human interactions. So that I thought was really interesting in terms of how to design for happiness first. I forgot to mention, but a number of these most beautiful images are by Edward Bertinsky, Bertinsky, who did the movie The Anthropocene, which talks about us as planet shapers, the human epoch. So you'll see these images throughout. Restoring natural connections. Well, again, another concept that was new to me is my background originally was math physics, and I knew all about entropy, and I'm sure almost all of the engineers here will be able to give you a long spiel on entropy, but I'd never heard of autopoiesis. Nature doesn't have entropy. Nature has something called autopoiesis, and that means self-creation. In nature, things don't fail and become garbage. Nature is constantly regenerating itself. And something magical happens to us when we rewild our cities and reconnect ourselves to wild nature. We remember autopoiesis. We remember that we're not machines and just about to break down and fall apart and become garbage. We remember that, oh yeah, we are constantly renewing and regenerating. And nature, when we're engaged with it, heals us and regenerates us. So again, very important to connect us through natural corridors back to wild nature. Something else I didn't know was our brains have centers, not just the visual centers, which we've all heard a lot about and we probably even studied when we were doing our design studies, but our brains have sound centers, and we filter sounds into categories. Our brains, our response to sound is encoded in our genome. You can't not have a response to music. And the response to music fires muscles in your body as if you were dancing. And in some languages, music and dance are the same word. So even if you're not moving, if you're hearing music, your body is firing those muscles and it wants to dance. Speech, you can't not hear speech. You know that it's speech, it's not noise, you know that it's speech. And noise is divided into different kinds of noise. And one of the things that we have forgotten in our designs is that we have something called the startle response. And you know, you've heard about when you smell something, it goes straight to that reptilian brain. It's the same thing with the startle response. A loud bang or noise, you don't think, you just jump. So that triggers your fight or flight. So we're constantly surrounded by big bad noises. When we sleep in our apartments, we hear all this banging outside, at work, and your startle response is triggered without you being able to control it at all. So the antidote to that is to really design and understand that we need to be protected from this noise pollution because it triggers our cortisol levels. And we need to be exposed to music and sacred sounds and better sounds and sounds of nature. University of Stockholm did a study, and they found that just natural sounds played in the background significantly reduced cortisol levels. Because what's happening is your brain is thinking, oh, the birds are tweeting, the wind is blowing, everything is good, I can relax. So this is a big one. Remember I said that construction is expected to grow 118% at the same time that population is going to grow 31%? We need to start building only what is needed. According to UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, in the past 30 years, we've taken more out of the earth than in all of human history. And 70% of that's already back in landfill. But we're overbuilt. We're overbuilt in China, we're overbuilt in North America, we're overbuilt in Europe by about a factor of 1.2. So that means for every household, we've built 1.2 houses, and the numbers go on. So construction is 25% of the world's GDP. So it's a massive industry, and it's a business. And we're not building what we need, we're building for profit. And we need to stop that because if you go back to those metrics, those 5 capitals, we've got a false measure. Design to human scale. Again, going back to that limbic brain and the connections we need to make, we don't do well in very high density, where we're isolated from each other because we're living in these sky towers, and we don't need skyscrapers for density. New York City, Manhattan, the density is about 26,000 people per square mile. It's pretty high. But the United Nations recommends 36,000 people per square mile, which is higher. Vancouver, where I come from, the West End, is 56,000 people per square mile. No towers, maybe very few. Tokyo does not have a lot of towers, relatively speaking, and they're also at about 56,000 people per square mile. Paris. So I think most architects know that Paris is a city that has high density and no real skyscrapers. So again, this is a bit of a myth that we need skyscrapers for density. We don't. And EMFs, electromagnetic frequency. Now this is something where a lot of people are like, okay, that's a bit woohoo, but yeah, at this stage I can be a bit woohoo, that's okay. Electromagnetic sensitivity is a condition that the World Health Organization now recognizes, and Sweden is officially treating 2.5% of its population for this illness. I don't know how or why it works, but I do know that going back to brain science, as a creative person, I understand and I like to know that the alpha dreaming frequency of the brain, the creative, in the zone frequency, is between 7.5 and 12 hertz. The Earth's fundamental frequency is 7.83. It's called Schumann frequency. So if our Earth has a frequency of 7.83, and we oscillate, our brain frequency is 7.5 to 12, what does that tell you? We're kind of tuned, literally, to the Earth frequency. And when we have higher frequencies, like now we have gigahertz towers, there's a disruption. Our background magnetic field frequency is between 25 to 60 microtesla. There's almost nowhere on the planet now where you can get that lower background because we've just overwhelmed it with these higher magnetic flux generation that we're creating. And it's a big experiment. We don't know how that's going to impact us. We already know that it's impacting some of the bees and the birds and the way they manage their guidance systems. And EPDs, for those of you that don't know, that's Environmental Product Declaration, and that's a cradle-to-cradle measure. And what that will do is eventually allow us, once we stop building more and start reusing stuff, to close our landfills. So this image should be completely clear. So these are particulate matter less than 10 micrometers in diameter, so that's PM10. And these densities, blue is where they're over the World Health Organization guidelines, and red is where they're way over. This should also not be red. This is the ocean. And as many of you know, our oceans are taking up the excess heat from the excess CO2es that we've pumped out. And in fact, we now know that the oceans have absorbed 90% of the excess heat. And I don't have her name here, but some young researcher did the math and determined that the oceans have absorbed 5 Hiroshima bombs per second of energy since 1990. And they are reaching their tipping point. So this goes to why we're all here today, which is reducing emissions, reduce emissions, reduce emissions. That's our number one. But this is giving us some background. So this probably is very familiar to you, this number, 22 gigatons, if we can emit that. And then after 2050, we have to somehow emit nothing. This compares to what we emit today, which is 33. But that's just for our buildings and our cars, what we're involved in our industry, most of which is relating to construction. The human race, because of land use change, so that goes to burning forests to create grazing land, actually emits 53 gigatons of CO2es. So we actually have to get from 53 to 22 in just a couple of decades if we're going to keep the impact of the emissions steady. Our temperature will continue to rise for 100 years even if we do this, even if we get to zero by 2050. So this is an image of, it's a Siemens Smart City image. And we hear a lot about wind and we hear hydrogen. There is something called Generation 4 nuclear, which I think is very interesting. Bill Gates is funding a group called TerraPower. And one of the things, again, with the electric car and the battery and our nuclear power and our fuel cells is we have spent, not fuel cells, we have spent fuel rods. And we have a site called Holtec, New Mexico, that is now housing, or will be able to house, and almost full, 120,000 metric tons of these spent fuel rods. Nuclear power is currently 20% of the generated electricity in America and 11% worldwide. So it is already a major industry. And the using up of those spent fuel rods is a challenge, and it's a big problem with the industry. So this Generation 4, the units are the size of a refrigerator, they're buried, they cannot melt down, and they use the spent fuel rods. So that is another type of energy that we can use for distributed energy. And it's just all of these things are happening all around the world where people are putting their minds to solving these kinds of problems. This is something called concentrated solar. I think this one is in Andalusia, Spain. So wind and solar, because from where I'm coming from, wind is solar, generate 50 gigawatts in the year 2000 generated, and now we're at 1,300 gigawatts or 1.3 terawatts. So that's a big jump. It's an exponential growth in the amount of wind and solar power, but it's still only 3% predicted by 2040 of the global electrical generation. So it's still not enough. And that's why we need all these other renewable and clean power sources. One of the things that, going back to my first principles about our responsibilities and what we do and why we do it, is we need daylight. There's a word I really like, it's called etiolated, E-T-I-O-L-A-T-E-D. Sounds like etiolated, but it's, you pronounce it with a D. And without light, plants become thin and white and weak. And without daylight, we also become thin and white and weak. And that's because we have these non-visual receptors that were discovered in the year 2002. And the morning light is yellow-green, and that triggers cortisol. The noon light is blue, and that triggers more cortisol and wakes us right up. And the evening light is amber, and that triggers melatonin. And at night, we go through what's called the melatonin repair cycle. And if we don't have the bright light in the day, the natural sunlight, our melatonin repair cycle is depressed or non-existent. And that is the repair cycle that fights cancer, that fights all of the toxins and illnesses that are attacking your body just in the natural course of a day. So when you don't get that daylight in the middle of the day, you don't go into the deep repair cycle, and you may become unwell. So it's very important that we get full sun in the day, and that we get that amber light at night, and that we get true dark in the middle of the night. So again, to design and remember that we need daylight. This is a fundamental principle of biology. Islands are where species go to die. And what this means is that if you have an island and you cut it off, eventually one species will dominate and all the others will fall away. But an island can be a roof garden. An island can be a city block. An island can just be a forest cut off by freeways. Nature lives in ribbons, rivers, coastlines, mountain ranges, forest corridors, and we need to remember that when we design. So my fourth principle is respect and protect eco-corridors and abandon the paved grid. And we think of the paved grid as just, we don't even think of it. We just assume it's got to be there. Well, it doesn't really. It's up to us. And in 1997, researcher Susan Simard at UBC discovered a forest root fungal network. And she calls it the Wood Wide Web. Have you heard of it? Yes. But when you think about it, it's not just a cool thing, and if you've read that book, The Secret Life of Trees, it's, the root of the tree is the brain of the tree, and in the root, the chemicals that we find in our brains, like serotonin, we find in the root. It's not just an interesting thing, it's a responsibility that we have now that we know that, to help trees connect underground and to not put them in little concrete pits where we're literally chopping their brain off, and to help them to understand, to look and see where the forest corridor is. And the easiest way to do that, as we move from the industrial to the digital age, is to use LIDAR. And you can see where the underground rivers are, and that's where the forest wants to be. So we have mapping capacity now that we should use as an underlay for all of our developments. So we can find and respect and protect these eco-corridors. So this doesn't look like a city to you and me, But as far as nature is concerned, this is what a city looks like. Because we drain all the water away from the surface of our cities, because we drain wetlands, our cities look like deserts as far as nature is concerned. And by 2050, 80% of us will live in coastal cities. And what this means is we're creating deserts along the coast. And when we do that, there's an impact 400 miles inland. And the forest for 400 miles inland of that coast will dry out through the desertification process. And then we will see wildfires, and then we will see more emissions. And that's exactly what's happening in many parts of the world. So we're not connecting the dots yet. We're not thinking because we have this hard pan city, we have a problem with the forest. And yes, things are warming up, and that's part of it. But to understand that we must keep our cities green to prevent this cycle is something that we can actually take care of. Principle number 2, we're getting down to the most important. Protect all waters and wetlands. Discharge nothing to the ocean. So I think sometimes we think in construction, well, we're not discharging anything to the ocean. You know, we're the good guys. The Marianas Trench is the deepest part of the ocean. And it was thought until very recently that the particulates that were discharging the plastics and everything were kind of going in these columns down. And so people wanted to know, scientists wanted to know, how far down does it go? And what are the concentrations like at the deepest level? And very disappointingly, it was discovered that the concentrations are 1,900 times higher at the bottom of the Marianas Trench than they are at the surface. There was PCB waste at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and PCBs are from electrical systems that were banned in 1979. And the concentrations were 1,900 times greater at the bottom of the Marianas Trench than in the coastal waters. So everything we do, somehow eventually we have to think, might land up there. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we know where stuff came from and where it goes on our sites. Without water, there can be no life. That's a fundamental principle. But this was a fact that shocked me. 97% of the water on our planet is salt water. 2% of the water on our planet is locked up in ice caps. That leaves only 1% of fresh water. That's all the aquifers, all the rivers, all the lakes. Is 1% of all the water on the planet. And we waste it. So if you deeply realize that without fresh water there's no life on land, and that 1% of all water on the planet is fresh water, I think we would all take better care of that 1%. And wetlands are the most important for biodiversity, for water filtration, for keeping our oceans clean. Very often as we develop by the ocean, the coastal cities, we are draining and destroying wetlands. And the number one thing we need to remember is wetlands should never be built on, no matter what. Okay, so if construction is going to change, how's that going to impact our world? Look at the word construct, construction. A construct is an idea. Construction is the building of ideas. This is Stonehenge. There are 10,000 menhir sites throughout Europe. This is a simple construction, and it represents geomancy, which is earth divination, or the careful placing of objects on the land to mark sacred sites. Another simple construction, this represents geometry, which is earth measuring, and it also represents geomancy. So that was the thinking at the time. This is a cathedral. This represents the thinking of trigonometry, which is angle measuring, when we were able to figure out the buttresses and the Gothic arches. But it also represents geometry and geomancy. This is the ACSA offices by Paragon and Johannesburg. This looks like complexity. This is calculus. Calculus is the language of the industrial age. So this represents a different way of thinking, and there is no geomancy in there anymore. This is just a very simple leaf, and you may see that as, very simple. But the language here is nonlinear algebra, fractal geometry, the language of fuzzy logic. This is the language of the digital age. This is the language that allows us to predict weather, that allows us to GPS our way through traffic, that allows us to build our energy models. This is the language of the future. So this is an industrial city. The industrial city, the paradigm there was get the people off the land and into the factory. In the factory, they will use machines to make machines. They will use machines to travel. The buildings will be machines to live in. And really, the idea of life and it was just sacrificed for this idea of the machine. This is not the future. This is you will see drawings like this all over the place. And just like the person in the Middle Ages could imagine a bigger cathedral, they could not imagine an office building. And just like we can imagine more and bigger office buildings and more and bigger freeways, we cannot yet imagine the digital city. We're not there. We don't have visions of it yet. But we will. And I showed you at the very beginning an image of the forest city in Wuzhou, China, which will start construction in 2020. I don't know if you remember that image. It was my second slide. But it looks very different from this. It respects the eco corridors. It's all green. It's mid-rise. It's the way, if we do it right, we will be living. If we do it wrong, that's the future. So this is the first principle of conscious construction, and that is design for life, not machines. As I said earlier, construction is the only industry that has not made the shift from the industrial to the digital age. And as I hope I've shown you with that progression of thought, it is inevitable that we will make the shift. It's already happening, and it's up to all of us to imagine what that future might look like. And I am very optimistic. I think it's going to be wonderful. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Teresa. Very insightful, very motivating. Do we have some audience questions for Teresa? Could I ask you to stand up and grab a microphone, please? There's one behind you. The gentleman with his hand up there can direct you.
I'll try a question. Is the microphone on? Thank you very much. That was an awesome presentation. You touched on so many different things. At the start, you talked about we're overbuilding, and I think speaking about, but we continue to build, and we're building real estate assets, and we're not perhaps building housing. Can you talk about maybe some examples of people that are doing that right, and maybe some things that we could do differently?
That's a really hard question. You know, I come from Vancouver, and I think there's a big pushback not to allow this overbuilding to continue and to build what we need. That's the other side of that, build only what is needed. So moving away from the high-rise condos, which are kind of overbuilt, to what we're calling the missing middle. That's a good direction. Also seeing community efforts like some of the sacred buildings that we have, looking at them as things we should preserve and supporting those groups that want to preserve them, because those buildings are spectacular. They're actually musical instruments that you go inside and experience sound in. So when you retrofit them and turn them into libraries or hotels, you lose that. So there are those initiatives out there to really not just protect the building, but protect the functionality and the intent of the original social structure. And also, I think we're starting to see roads removed, lanes, unnecessary lanes, because we're starting to see lower use of cars. So when we say build only what is needed, we don't need as many roads. So bringing those back to community gardens through the lanes and enhancing our food security. So the movements are really small, because I think in every country we've separated the social need from the individual ability to make profit. And until we somehow change our financial structures, I don't really see that changing in a big way, unfortunately. But I mean, those are the small efforts that I've noticed. Yep.
My name is Lagman Azar. I'm an architect in Toronto. And just before I ask my question related to the previous question, I think not only we're overbuilding, we're also building the wrong things. But back to my question, I think that I look at the people in this room and I see a lot of familiar faces. And I can guess that a lot of people in this room are doing more than their share of contributing to the very important 12 principles that you outlined here today. So my question is that who is not listening? And how do we reach the majority, the dominant majority, who are moving and acting against all these 12 principles that you outlined here? And I think that what else can we do to accelerate the movement, if I can call it a movement, the effort to bring this message to everybody, or those who are actually the decision makers?
Yeah. That's a really good question. You know, I started my career as an architect and built a company around that, and then I realized, no, I have to really get into policy. And when we change the rules based on principles like this, then everyone has to follow those rules. And if we can impact policy, then we will effect change. So I know that as architects, engineers, developers, researchers, we sometimes think we're powerless, especially the researchers. There's so much good work that's done that the professionals don't even hear. So we need that communication. But we also need to work really closely with our policymakers. And what I've found is once we communicate and explain what it is we're looking for, like for instance, preservation of eco-corridors for all of these good reasons, you know, protecting species and habitat preservation, there's no resistance. You know, we find that, especially in Canada, once we get the ball rolling, sometimes our agencies will put codes out that are ahead of what we can do, but that's fine, we'll catch up. So I think there's a hesitancy sometimes in our industry to say, I'm a professional, I'm not going to lobby. That's not a good thing. I'm not going to get into politics. But yeah, I think we have to. I think we have to speak up. And I really, my message today is, hey, we're on the brink of a huge shift in our industry. We need to wake up, take action, and say, hey, we've got we've got solutions here. Because the message that we're hearing all around us with Extinction Rebellion and all this stuff is like, the world is over. And it's not that. Like when you look at our industry, there's amazing good stuff happening. So it's just to go outside your comfort zone a little bit and speak to the people who have the power to codify or put policies in place that will support the work you want to do, right?
Thank you.
Okay.